Well, welcome everybody to Tuesday Together Talk. I'm Reverend Rebecca Burrow. I'm the founder and CEO of Building Reconciliation, Inclusion, Diversity, and Gender Equity. It's a long name. That's why we often refer to ourselves as Bridge. I am so excited to be here on this evening with a very special guest. You all know by now that we are honoring the legacy of Professor Rufus Burrow Jr. And I am so excited for what I've already seen in the comments. Tyler, you nailed it in honor of Rufus Burrow. I trust that you're in reasonably good spirits this evening. Yes, that was one of the things he would say when you walked into his classroom at Christian Theological Seminary. Thank you all for being here. Carrie, good evening to you. Also, Rachel, good evening to you. Dr. Deborah Yonker, one of my favorite people in the world. Thank you so much for being here on this evening. So I'm not going to delay. I am going to first remind you that, of course, we know that um, my husband, Dr. Rufus Burrow Jr. No, I did not call him Dr. Rufus Burrow Jr. Passed away. It's been almost 2 years ago already. And he was a great inspiration to so many folks. He was a professor, he was a mentor, he was an advisor, he was a confidant, but he was my husband, and he was the father to Sharon Burrow Anderson and the pappy to Bailey Rain Anderson. And I know that so many of you out there have your own incredible memories of Dr. Rufus Burrow Jr. So I'm going to ask if you are a student or if you have, if are a colleague or whatever your relationship was with Rufus on this evening, if you don't mind just sharing something briefly, and we'll make sure we acknowledge your comment by highlighting it within the segment on this evening. Also, throughout this evening, I will put up different books that Rufus wrote over his career. I was just sharing with Dr. Timothy Knight, Reverend Dr. Timothy Knight, that Rufus, I wrote, I believe, 5 books, even in the short time that we were married. And so he was definitely a man on a mission, but purposeful. And he was, I could go on and on and on. Sharon, thank you for joining in, and she'll be here on one of these Tuesdays this month. Um, and Tyler says student, and Rufus Burrow gave the ethical charge at my ordination. Yes, he was there for so many, and for that I am thankful that I can honor my husband's legacy and life with integrity. And I'm going to shut my mouth so we can bring Dr. Timothy Knight. I'm not going to call you doctor all night long, okay? You need to know that. Um, I'm going to bring him into the conversation. Timothy, if you can just give us a brief introduction, tell our Tuesday Together Talk audience who you are and a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, as many of the audience members, I am a beloved. Um, I'm I'm a person who I believe was both beloved and I held Dr. Burrow, Rufus Burrow Jr. in the highest regard. I was a student of his. I was born and raised in East St. Louis, Illinois. Uh, I am the first person of my family to be born with civil rights, having been born in October of 1964. I came to Indianapolis, Indiana, where I studied uh, theology at Enon Bible College, later attending CTS, where I was one of Rufus's students, and later went on to earn a PhD in human services and social and community services. I have been in ministry since I was the age of 13, having taught my first Sunday school class at 13, having preached my first sermon at 15, and was ordained at 21 upon graduating from uh, the Pentecostal Assemblies of the World Proprietary School, Enon Bible College, back in 1986. I was a police officer from 1992 to 2016, serving 23 years there. And so that pretty much captures my life's work and who I am as a person. Um, I think I'll stop there.
Okay. All right. Well, you have accomplished a lot. And Dr. Juncker, um, she says that Dr. Burrow was my dear mentor and colleague at CTS Indianapolis. And I must say, knowing this, that Dr. Deborah Juncker and her husband, Dr. Tercio Juncker, were some of Rufus' favorite people. And he really thought highly of them. And they were definitely top of his list. So, Timothy, I'm going to ask you. Oh, by the way, just so you all know, Timothy, Dr. Timothy, Reverend Dr. Timothy, he and Kim King, who was also a friend of mine at CTS, they officiated, performed Rufus and our wedding ceremony. So, um, there is a there's just a lot of history here, and so I just thought I'd share that with you all. That's not why I selected him. I selected him to have this conversation with me tonight because he was another person that my husband held to the highest regard. So I'm going to just start tonight by asking you this simple question: what was your first impression of Professor Rufus Burrow Jr.?
That's a great question. With regard to the Yonkers and many other people that were dear to Rufus, he always took time to share how they were doing. So I probably know more about the Yonkers than the Yonkers can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
He doted on them quite often, and he believed in their work. So um, thank you for the work that you've done with Rufus, and that's to the Yonkers and to the many others that are in this on this call. So my relationship with Rufus was born in conflict. I think as we all grow and develop, I think most of us have theological views and perspectives that are aspirational.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the things that we're constantly striving to improve about ourselves, to live that ideal life, to be that ideal representative of Christ. And I say that because when I encountered Rufus, I also encountered his blind spot. He resented my presence in his classroom because at the time I was a sworn police officer. And I think I represented, maybe in the deepest recesses of his thinking, oppression. We know that in the United States of America and really globally, law enforcement, well, let's just say within the U.S.,
Mm-hmm.
law enforcement has never been allied to poor people or people of color from its historical foundations. And I know that may be a controversial statement, but we could have a discussion on that another time. Um, and I think I represented the oppression that his work in advocating for the acknowledgement of the dignity of all human beings contested.
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a conversation at the beginning of one of the classes. And this is when we had really our very first exchange. It was a classroom full of people. And he said some harsh things. And I pushed back. And I told him that we were more allies than we were enemies. And that while working within those racist systems and those oppressive systems, I was a person who was countercultural, and I never did fit within those systems because I was always advocating for justice for human beings of all kinds, and it just really didn't fit that the type of pervasive mentality that existed back then in law enforcement, and in some places still exists today. And so I think when he realized that I was just as passionate, and while I was unaware of the theological and philosophical um, constructions around personalism, I was a thoroughgoing personalism from the early ages of my existence.
Mm-hmm.
And so once he articulated his views, I became more intrigued with his work. And, that first paper I turned in, all it said was, see me. And it was in red, see me. And I went to his office, and that began a wonderful, wonderful relationship.
Yeah.
I'll pause there and wait on your next question.
Okay. Well, you brought back so many memories while you were talking, and one is, perhaps I believe Rufus' strongest students know this. They learn this quickly, that he loved the tension that you would, a student would bring into the classroom, meaning that he wanted you to be a thinker. He wanted to know that about his students, and he required it, matter of fact. And I know that because I remember some of those papers. That first one, I thought, oh, heck no. That first one I got back, I thought, oh, no, 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 no. Now, I want to move us forward into this is August 24th, marks 2 years since Rufus passed. What do you miss most about your teacher, your mentor, your friend, your confidant?
In some ways, Rufus and I had a metaphysical connection, and I can only explain that via a couple of stories. When I was on my working on my dissertation, when I was in my doctoral program, it was almost like on cue. Whenever I was experiencing some form of anxiety, he would call me.
Mm-hmm.
And he would predict where I was in my academic program at the time. And he would say a few words of encouragement and hang up. Mm-hmm. And I remember I was in the comprehensive research phase of my work, and I was panicked. I had a deadline to meet. I was down to like 3 days, I think. Mm-hmm. And I just resolved that I wasn't going to complete the work. And I remember being in bed in fetal position in a dark room. And for some reason, my phone was in my hand. And the phone rang, and I answered it, and it was Rufus. And he said, "Timothy, this is Rufus Burrow Jr." He said, "You need to get it done, Timothy. Get up and get it done." And I'm looking around the room like, is there a camera in here? And he said, this is not about you. It's about the boys. At the time, I was the executive director for a nonprofit organization that advocated for African American males and worked to reduce the high incarceration and homicide rates of Black boys. And Rufus was very interested in that work. And so he said, this is about the boys. Get up, Timothy, and get it done. And he hung up. I didn't say a word. And I got up and I dragged myself to my chair and I went to work. And I worked through the night. And I recall I would take naps, like a 10-minute or 20-minute nap in the recliner. And then I'll go back to the computer. And I recall my ankles swelling because I sat for so long. And I completed my comps and I passed those comps. And so that was the first story. But then around 3 o'clock in the morning on an August 25th morning, I woke up from a dream. It was more of a nightmare. And I was having an argument with Rufus. And it was about writing. And we were going back and forth. And about 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock that morning, you called me to tell me that he had transitioned. So what I miss most about him was his caring. Yes, he was a masterful scholar, prolific writer. He was an advocate and a wonderful mentor to many, but he was also a loving and caring and empathetic and empathic friend and supporter. And he also was the kind of person, while he was extremely principled and clear and focused, it wasn't important to him that you buy all of his ideas. It was important to him that you develop your own theology and that it was well-grounded and well-articulated and thoroughly thought through. So I would say a loving mentor is what I miss most about Rufus.
Yeah. Well, you're taking me to that place where I'm trying my best to maintain my emotions for this evening. You mentioned the story when you were working on your PhD, and I think you said you were preparing those qualifying exams. Is that correct? Yeah. I'm wondering, in addition to that piece of advice, what is the most memorable advice piece of advice that Rufus gave to you that continues to remind you to get it done?
So Rufus was quite frustrating to me when it came to that, especially early on when I was a student. Later on, after I graduated and completed my own academic work, his methodology with me changed. I was always curious as to about the writing process. In fact, in between each semester of school, I would either interview someone who was a prolific writer, or I would read books about writing. And so I would call him and just ask questions about writing. And he would simply say, just get it done. He said, whatever you have to do. He said, some people do outlines, some people don't. Just do what you got to do. Just get it done. And he said, just get it done, Timothy. And I was frustrated because I wanted technical advice. I wanted to know, how many hours should I be spending there? I wanted to know, how should I collect notes and organize them? Should I keep a writing journal or not? All of these, questions are really meaningless if you weren't intentional about getting the work done. And he was just simply say, plant your butt in the chair and get it done. You
Mhm.
know, some people drink coffee, you know, do whatever you need to do. Get that coffee, sit there and get it done.
Mhm.
But later, after I finished my work, he began to invite me to read his work,
Mhm.
read his manuscripts. And that was quite the honor. He would even invite me um, to write what do we call those blurbs for the book.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
and he also invited me to write a paper with him. We did write a paper that we submitted and was accepted at the Western Journal of Black Studies about King and nonviolence,
Mhm.
Bozak, and a few other non anti-apartheid activists in South Africa. That experience, he was teaching me in that experience. He got a little more technical with me doing our writing together
Mhm.
and writing of his book reviews. And he would say, "Do it again." And that was another thing he would do. He wouldn't say what was wrong with it; just do it again. And after the eighth or ninth revision, he'd say, "Okay, this is worth using."
Wow.
um,
Mm.
other than that, on the more technical side, again later on, he would we would have conversations about writing. He would talk about uh, locking himself into his dungeon and keeping a book in his hands. And he gave me most of the books from his CTS library. I have probably 20 or 30 boxes of books. I
Yeah.
literally put his office out. It
Yeah.
took several trips. I was honored that he did that as well for me.
Mhm.
And so things like before his his editor would see it the first time, he would have revised it 7 times.
Mhm.
And just the intentionality of getting it right and doing the work of researching and making sure that you were truth telling
Yeah.
and doing a proper analysis and um, developing strong synthesizing the work. So those are some of the things that Rufus left me with in terms of writing.
Yeah. Thank you, Timothy, for sharing that. I did, for you all that's watching, the article, the journal article that Timothy wrote along with Rufus is Martin Luther King Jr.'s Doctrine of Nonviolence in South Africa. And it was published in the Western Journal of Black Studies. And as you can see, there's the volume and the numbers if you want to find that at some point. One of the, the things you highlighted, and I share this with people, and because I learned it from Rufus, and also sometimes Rufus and I would talk with some of the folks that were he had met through me that were interested in writing or interested in PhD programs and things of that nature. Um, Rufus was very specific about getting the work done by doing the work. People would often say, "How do I become a writer?" Or "How did you do it?" And he said, "I sat myself in the chair," and not necessarily in those words, but I plant my butt in that chair and I would write. And some days it was one sentence, some days it was paragraphs, some days several pages, some days nothing, computer glaring back at me. And I often try to tell people, share people with people that story because so many times uh, I know folks that think it happens just by writing. They just want to, I guess, gather a book together and say, "I've done this book," without doing the work. And I think the other thing is sometimes people confuse the sort of work that Rufus did, which was highly academic writing. with, just writing maybe a self-help book or something of that nature. And it was very different type of work, and it required a lot of patience, practice, and encouraging of yourself. But as you said, and as he often told his students and his mentees, uh, you know, you got to sit your butt in that chair and do it. And so he would lock himself away in the torture chamber, Timothy, the torture chamber, and he would write, and he would write, and he would write, and he would read, and he would read. And so, even on those days where he was uh, having to endure chemo treatments and things, Rufus was sitting in writing, sitting in the chair. And matter of fact, he completed a book, two books, while going through cancer treatments. Um, and so he was committed to it because he knew that's what God had called him to do. And so it was important for him to get it done. So,
I think if I may add, in talking to Rufus, he made it abundantly clear that each of us has a lens that is dissimilar, distinct from everyone else. And possessing that lens qualifies us to do the creative work of writing.
yeah,
There's no two of us will be the same.
right.
One thing he often also impressed was that he says, Timothy, uh, it won't get easier. You'll
Right.
just get better at it. He
Yeah.
said, it's tedious work.
Yeah.
It won't get easier.
Yeah.
You'll just get better at doing it. So just plant yourself and get it done.
Yeah.
And so he was a perfect example. But I think more so as I think about what really bonded me to Rufus was that he also taught me what it meant to have the identity of a scholar.
Mm-hmm.
I recall after finishing my dissertation and defending the dissertation, he and I had a conversation. And one of the first things he says, now, Timothy, don't be like some of these people. He said, you have to put doctor in front of everything. He said,
Yeah.
now you can do that for a couple of years.
Yeah.
He said, but Timothy, you need to let that go.
Yeah.
He said, let it go.
Yeah.
He said, now I might do it if I'm writing a reference for a student or I'm writing an official publication, but let that go.
Yeah.
And do the work of a scholar, which is teaching and mentoring and writing and publishing. And so right near the end of his life, I was seeking to have the kind of relationship that he had with two of his mentors, Walter G. Mueller and Peter Botacci from Boston University. I think I came probably as close as anyone to that, in that he was able to spend 2 weeks with each of them working on his manuscript for the book Personalism, the Introduction to Personalism.
Mm-hmm.
And so he and I talked about a book on personalism, a working title that I had, Personalism in Black Boys, or Black Boys in Personalism, or Personalism in the African American Male. And so he and I had many, many conversations, and I didn't know that he was ill at that time.
Yeah.
And so I remember having a conversation with you, and I said, I'd like to come down and spend a couple of weeks poring over this work and asking him questions. And you said, no, his physical constitution was not such that he can entertain guests. His immune system was low. And that's when I realized that he was far worse off than I had imagined. So, he instilled in me the discipline, and his other students, those who would listen,
Mm-hmm.
the discipline to commit to get the work done. And it was about the work, not about us, but it was about the work of preserving the dignity of all human beings.
Yeah. Wow. I want to put this comment back up that Dr. Tercio Juncker wrote. Dr. Rufus Burrow Jr., we miss you. And yes, we do. Thank you, dear Rebecca, for bringing alive so many great memories that still resonate in the hearts of so many of us. Um, one of the things that it has resonated with me while just living without Rufus' physical presence in these past couple of years is that Rufus touched so many lives. There are students that, you know, perhaps they didn't have the best relationship with Rufus, but those students also will say, he challenged me. He made me work harder. He brought something out of me that I didn't even know was there. And then also for his colleagues and different people he worked with around the country that he wrote, worked on books together. Lewis Baldwin being one of those folks. Those he was a force, but he was also a person that has left such a legacy that it reminds me of the importance of all of us. Those of you that are listening this evening, we all should live our lives in a way where that when we leave this earth, we have left something great for others to live on and to be able to make an impact through the lives that live on. Otherwise, what good is it, if we are just here just to accumulate a whole bunch of things? And if you knew Rufus, Dr. Somerville talked about it during the service a couple of years ago. He talked about Rufus and that his uniforms when he was in front of his students at CTS, when he was uh, lecturing or anything, he would wear suit and tie, always suit and tie. Rufus would go to those administrative meetings, those faculty meetings, meetings with the board trustees, and he would wear his other uniform, some jeans and some gym shoes he had probably had for probably about 30 or 40 years, and either his tan khaki shirt or his green khaki shirt. He was not concerned with accumulating a lot of material things. What was important to him is what you all see behind me, just a small percentage of, and that's his books. And that was doing the work that God had purposed him to do. And so the material things just wasn't that important. And so I'm saying that to remind uh, other folks that are now trying to figure out how to live their life and how to uh, think about their legacy. You can think about leaving a legacy of material things, or you can think about leaving a legacy that will go from generation to generation to generation. Because I live in Florida, y'all know that they they have banned a lot of books, and probably all the books they have banned sits in this library, plus a whole bunch of other ones I'm sure they would like to ban. So what they can't do is rob you of your mind. They can't rob you of the legacy that Rufus has left, and that's a legacy of education, a legacy of helping us to become better people. And so, Timothy, I want to ask you a question. One of Rufus' strong philosophical beliefs was in personalism, his theological belief in personalism. I would like for you to give a brief idea to our viewing audience this evening why you think, first, define briefly personalism if you can. I know it's pretty broad, but if you can define it just from an everyday perspective, and then share why you think personalism is so important in the work of ministry today.
That's a great question. So Personalism began as a philosophical construction. In fact, some call it philosophy, theology. There were various schools. One was in California, the other was in Boston. These were the two primary areas. So you would have the California version of personalism, and then you had the model that came out of Boston University. And by the way, Rufus wanted to learn personalism, and this for the same reasons that Martin Luther King wanted to learn personalism. Many don't know that, we accredit Benjamin Alexander from Morehouse, and then Crozier Theological Seminary, and Walter Rauschenbusch from Hell's Kitchen, New York, and the Social Gospel, and Gandhi. We tend to attribute King's philosophical views to those personalities, but King actually went to Boston University, and he had the very two men that later mentored Rufus, Peter Bertocci and Walter G. Mueller, to mentor him, and they labeled King the fifth generational personalist because he actually lived it out, and it became an applied theology. It informed his work and his belief in nonviolence. So personalism basically acknowledges the sacredness and dignity of all human beings, that is inalienable, that we can ignore it, but we can't reduce it. That the sacredness, human beings' sacredness, their value, their dignity is irreducible, and that we were created after the supreme person, who is God. The reason it's important is because the main tenet of personalism, and that is, it is the defined or seen as the defining principle of all existence. It begins with the great person God, and then we created in the image of God. And that then informs our perspective about how we deal with each other on the planet Earth. Because if each of us realizes that we are created in the image of God, we are persons in the image of God, and that we all possess this intrinsic value imbued upon us by God, then we can't lift a hand to hurt the other. It really informs nonviolence. And you see that if you read the article that Rufus and I wrote, that's borne out in the article. And we kind of wrestle with the tension of when is violence appropriate. But a thoroughgoing personalist sees and acknowledges the dignity of all human beings, no matter where they're from. This also means that your work isn't tribal. It isn't confined to a particular doctrinal construction, a particular religious organization, because that defining principle is how we elevate, protect, ensure the full actualization of every human being. And so that is, in short, personalism, and I think that is why it is so important. Personalism has been applied to politics, education, law, of course, born out of philosophy and theology. It is that prime tenet that aligns with Rauschenbusch's social gospel. It aligns with Jesus and those prophets from 8th BCE. Those prophets that say, this is why we're here, to give attention to the poor and the fatherless and the motherless and the widows and those that are without, those that are disempowered. Our commitment is in protecting the dignity of all people, and not just them, but even the oppressor. And that's the challenging part of personalism, is how do we love people who have, by all definitions that we use on this planet, are evil, and who devise systems to destroy and undermine human dignity around the planet.
Well, thank you. So one of the reasons why I asked you to explain personalism, many of you know that Rufus is one of the, well, he's one of the greatest scholars, King Martin Luther King Jr. scholars. He was around the really around the globe, and so many people quote King, and I say this often on Tuesday Together Talk. So many people quote King without understanding King's philosophy and theology. And so they quote King and they quote him out of context. They quote him to, fit an agenda or something that they want to say during a holiday, King holiday or something. And I think it's important that as we continue to honor the legacies of our greats, that we understand their philosophy and their theology, because that then helps guide us more in the direction of what the legacy means, what the life of that person meant, instead of social media memes and these one line quotes and things that we have become a society of. We have become that society, and we are missing the essence of who our greats were, and we're also missing what they were trying to convey in the work that they dedicated their lives to. And so I don't want to reduce, I want us to stop reducing our greats, our ancestors, our people that we rely on for our helping us construct our identity and things as not just Black people but people in general. I want us to start reducing them to just a quote and start understanding more about who the person was. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted you to explain personalism. And we only have 15 more minutes, Timothy, so I told you it'll be difficult to get through all the questions I wanted to ask you. But you did speak briefly about some of the mandates or requirements that personalism uh, involves. But I want you now to start thinking of, I want you to talk about ministry and how Rufus, how he viewed the church and what he would say is the responsibilities of pastors and leaders of the church, and particularly the Black church.
Rufus was a proponent of advocating for the powerless. He did so within the context of CTS, and not just with students. He did so with faculty. And he sought to align himself with, again, that universal big T truth, as close as we could get to it. So there were no racial boundaries in Rufus's work.
Right.
If it was an injustice served, it was an injustice that he addressed.
Yeah.
And he did so with very little regard to his own well-being. And so in this sense, Rufus's ministry was about, and he said this very clearly, putting it on the line.
Yeah.
He said we have to put it on the line. Meaning that those physical, those material things that concern most people have to take a back seat to human dignity and preserving human dignity. He once made a comment about, and this he did this in the classroom. He says, I don't mind. He said he wouldn't give. He started to comment, I won't give to a church that spends $1 million in renovations. He says, let me take that back. He says, I don't mind a church if they want to spend $1 million renovating it and making sure it has soft pews for people to sit on and air conditioning and a great sound system and a nice organ. He says, um, as long as they invest equal amount of money, attention, and passion to the community wherein that church is located.
Yeah.
So Rufus was about the grassroots. He was about meeting people where they were. One of the things, first speeches he gave our class was that the janitors, the sanitation workers in our schools were not there to serve us, and that we should not leave our refuse behind for them to clean it up. And so he was always advocating for the weak. Even in his work with the OK program, he was a board member. He made time to spend one-on-one with the boys. He invited them to his house. He fed them. Even in his work with me, one-on-one sessions at Burger Kings and coffee shops and at his breakfast tables. And so he was committed to the work of developing people from a grassroots perspective. Yeah. And advocating for them.
Yeah. I think one of the things I appreciated about him was his perspective of the church. He wasn't there to beat the church down or church leaders or pastors down. He held them to a standard that is very biblical. But I know that a lot of pastors found difficult because he expected them to do much more than to, wear a fancy suit and be up behind the podium every Sunday, just preaching. There was so much more work to do. And that was his thing, that we had to be more concerned with the lives of individuals than our own life. And I think that, I miss his voice today because, some of what I'm seeing in church life today is a bit disappointing. But I hope that we can begin to really embrace some of his teachings and understanding. My sister, the first time she heard Rufus speak, it was at the King Day service at St. John in Indianapolis there. And after the King Day service, she came up to me. She was like, well, I didn't know we were getting in trouble today, but because Rufus just laid it out. That was his thing. He was consistent. He didn't care who the audience was. He was consistent in saying, this is our responsibility. If we want different, if we want change, if we want to see better, we have to do better. We have to do more, and we have to own it. It's our responsibility. If you are a leader, it is your responsibility to function as an ethical leader, a moral leader, a leader with integrity, and a leader that is more concerned about the people than you are in how the people can serve you. So, okay, let me get off.
I think the full mention, you mentioned it in one of his last books, to one of his last publications, his Ethical Prophets Along the Way.
Yes.
Those Hall of Famers. And he talked about that book for some time, and he was able to complete it and publish it. And I think it encapsulates what his thinking was about Christian leadership.
Yes. Yeah. Well, because we're running out of time, and I'm so thankful that you are sharing this conversation with me. Before we leave you all, audience, if you have any questions or if you have any comments you want to add as we prepare to wind down this evening, please feel free to add your voice. If there is anything that you want to know that that we haven't talked about, if you want to know more about the works of Professor Burrow, please make sure just drop us a comment. I also would like to let you know that on next week, Dr. L. Susan Bond, who is another student of was a student of Rufus. She is a professor at a HBCU. She will be with me on next week, sharing this conversation as we continue to honor the life and legacy of Professor Rufus Burrow. And I think you all should come on back and hear what she has to say. She'll add an additional perspective than Timothy. And so it is well worth coming back next week. So we'll make sure that we drop you all an announcement, an event calendar invite, or what have you next before the week is out. Timothy, I want to ask you one last thing because we are now working on a legacy project. And some of you might have seen the announcement. It is the Dr. Rufus Burrow Jr. Black Church Leadership Program. We are talking about it tonight. It has not been launched yet, but we have been working on it for a little over, a little bit over half a year now. We've been working on it, and we have some great people on the team that is helping us put together um, this incredible program. In addition to the team members, Sharon Burrow Anderson. I always want to, I keep her Burrow, okay? But she is also working with us to, uh, we all have a different perspective. So Sharon is adding her perspective to the work of her daddy. So we are excited about the Dr. Rufus Burrow Jr. Black Church Leadership Program, and keep your eyes and ears open for our launch date. It will happen soon. In the meantime, Timothy, I want you to just tell the audience, why do you think the Black church leader, not just the Black church leadership, the Dr. Rufus Burrow Jr. Black Church Leadership Program, why do you think it's important, and what do you think it can add to leadership programs today?
I think the leadership program uh, provides a great foundation for both aspiring and existing leaders in helping them to think more critically
Mm-hmm.
and thinking outside, being able to think outside the confines of their institutions, which I think oftentimes working within a particular dogma may create blind spots and limit our service to the world. And I'm not saying that a ministry should serve the world. We have limitations. We have an audience that we have to address. But I think the work places the gospel closer to where Rufus might have envisioned it. And
Mm-hmm.
that is a global gospel, one that fits anywhere, one that works anywhere, not one that forces a particular praxis or a particular theology, but one that addresses those core principles that meet the mandate that Jesus left us, and that is to love one another.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we developed this program based on the teachings, the philosophy and theology of Dr. Rufus Burrow Jr. And all that you all have heard Tim talked about regarding his relationship with Rufus, and so many others, Dr. Junkers, that both Dr. Deborah and Dr. Tercio Juncker, um, Tyler, that Tyler Thompson that talked earlier about his experience with Professor Burrow. Um, so many folks, when we developed the program with Rufus students, his colleagues, how he interacted with them, his relationship with them, because all of those relationships and persons were examples of who Rufus was as an individual. It was his relationship with them was built on who God had called him to be to other people. And that's when we developed the program. And as we're continuing the work, we have kept all of his ideas in mind. And so they're infused, they're embedded, they are our drivers, they're guiding the program. And so we're looking so forward to the work that will happen. We will keep you posted going forward. Timothy Knight, is there anything else you want to add to our conversation? I know we didn't get to nearly most of the questions, but is there anything that you would like to add, any personal note about Rufus before we say good evening to our folks?
I'd just like to say that his legacy lives on, not only in his writings,
Yeah.
but in the way that he taught his students to interrogate their beliefs and to ensure that their beliefs align with the current needs
Mhm.
of the church and the community and the world. That we decentralize our faith, we take ourselves off center. I can recall one conversation with him, and it was during the time that Katrina happened. New Orleans was suffering, and I made the comment, "We were blessed." And he stopped me in my tracks, and he says, "I understand what people mean when they say we are blessed, but it also places us in competition with God's love. Does God love you more than he loved those
Right.
people suffering in Katrina? Does God love them less because they're suffering?" And he made me rethink um, my notions, which, after a while can become imperialistic.
Yeah.
And so I think that also is one of the benefits of the leadership program, is get us to interrogate those embedded beliefs and those notions, that we are some way more special than others of God's creation. And I think that's valuable for anyone who's entering service.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great reminder. Thank you all so much for tuning in this evening. This has it's somewhat difficult for me, but it's important for me also to have these conversations, because I want to continue to keep Rufus' legacy alive. And I have so many great people that will help me do that. But also, it's important that we honor a man who lived a good life, helping so many and supporting the work of so many. There are so many students that will tell you if it wasn't for Professor Burrow, they wouldn't have a PhD today, or they wouldn't be a professor somewhere, or a preacher or pastor somewhere, or whatever other work they're doing. Because his work was not just about encouraging people to become pastors or any of that, or even professors, but his work was about you becoming the best person you could be, and that you were doing what God had called you to do, but that you also loved your fellow human being, that you love one another, and that you practice human dignity. So, Lori Clark, thank you for this conversation on such a great man, Dr. R. Burrow Jr. Thank you, Lori. My Aunt Darlene says very interesting information on Professor Burrow. Dr. Deborah Yunker, thank you for this opportunity to remember and honor Professor Burrow. Um, Darlene said, I really missed an opportunity to meet such an inspiring man. And that he was. So we will keep talking about him and honoring him this month. I'm thinking that the conversations, I'm hoping that they will get a little easier for me as, we continue through this month. But I believe that we were all blessed. If you had an encounter with him, you were blessed as a result of him. And so I would hope that you will go out and do something kind for someone today and do some hard work. If you want to write, then sit your butt in your chair and write. If you are called to pastor and preach, do it with integrity, do it in service to your congregation or for your congregation, not just so your congregation can, give you an anniversary once a year, but do the work because it's what God has called you to do, and you do it with purpose. You do it on purpose, and you do it with integrity, and you do it as an ethical leader and a prophetic ethical leader. Rachel says, I have enjoyed listening to you, Miss Rebecca and Reverend Timothy, hearing who Mr. Burrow was, what he stood for. He is smiling down on you, Miss Rebecca and Reverend Timothy, and everyone who lives. He touched in such an inspiring way tonight. What a beautiful tribute to Dr. Rufus Burrow. Thank you so much, Rachel. I thank you all so much. Like I said, we will continue these conversations. We have Dr. L. Susan Bond. And for you preachers out there, Dr. Bond wrote a book on homiletics. If you are a CTS student, oh my God, it escapes me right now. Oh my goodness. But be here next week because she is a very good, actually, she's a great professor, but she also did wonderful work. In how she helped us frame preaching and thinking about preaching. And so be here next week with me as we have our conversation and as she can share from her perspective of Dr. Rufus Burrow Jr. All right. I'm Reverend Rebecca Burrow. Thank you again, Reverend Doctor. I'll call you Doctor one more time for the night. Reverend Dr. Timothy Knight. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please remember to follow us on Facebook at Reconciliation and Equity. Oh, we're also on Instagram and YouTube at Reconciliation and Equity. And you can also find us at www.reconciliationandequity.com. Make sure that you share the video if you have our recording for the night. Make sure you share it if you have some folks in your circle that you would like to remind them of who Dr. Burrow was to them, or if you just want to let them know, hey, this is why I am the great I am. All right. So good night, everybody. And I will see y'all next week. All right. Y'all hold on while we exit on out of here. Good night.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.